Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for being here for this workshop of the Growing Pro project financed by the European Commission, where we discuss a very hot topic today and the possible coexistence between vaccine and intellectual property right, and in particularly patents. There is a hot debate just because, you know, the Biden administration is pushing for a waiver on patents, but there are many reasons for which this should not be possibly a good idea. So today we will discuss about that with experts of innovation and property rights, and also expert on vaccine production. So we will have with us Fabrizio Chiodo, we will have with us Paul Nightingale, Margaret Kyle, and Giovanni Dosi. Well, before starting, I would like to show to you the first infographic released by the Growing Pro project. And we will discuss about the COVID pandemic, and within the infographic also about patent and vaccine. Okay, I hope that everybody like our first infographic. So the rest of the workshop is organized as follow. Every speaker is going to have 15 minutes where he discusses his idea or his vision about this possible problem between patents and property rights. And then we will have a second round possibly of comments and questions from either from the web or from the people that are here. So I would leave the floor to Fabrizio Chiodo. Fabrizio is a research assistant professor at the National Italian Research Council, and he's working on the Institute of Biomolecular Chemistry in Naples. He got a PhD in applied chemistry. He obtained a personal grant from the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, working at the Leiden Institute, and is also cooperating with the Finlay Institute of Havana, and is working on the development of the Soberanos, if I'm not wrong, 2, and other vaccine made in Cuba. So Fabrizio, you have the floor, 15 minutes. Thanks for being here.
So thanks a lot, well, Professor Oventini or Andrea. Thanks for the opportunity. And I feel honored, but at the same time, I already feel like I'm the underdog here, because I really imagine a conference where you have professional scientists, and then at some point, a young economist would appear discussing about vaccine. So actually, I do like this idea. But I feel very sorry if my language would be not the proper one. So I'm here just to show you the other sides of this game, war, whatever we're going to call it, with the different options that society have to vaccinate people. And I will show you the option of a public biotech like Cuba is doing with 5 SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidates now in clinical trial. So I'm going to give you just an overview. And again, I feel very sorry if at the end, I'm going to share with you my very naive economic suggestions. That is just actually sponsoring public biotech. So, you know, it's an honor, no? It's very easy, no, to be from a rich country. This economic system allow us to be the first one in getting the vaccines, allow us to reopen before the others. There are countries that soon will start the vaccination in the pediatric age, while in other countries, we still have the medical staff that will never see a vaccine before 2023. So again, these are the numbers. This is actually where the pandemic is at the moment. It's nothing finished yet. We are fighting it. It's fantastic success of science in general, but this is what we have to look at. That's the word at the moment. If I listen to the newspaper here in Europe, we have the feeling that everything is in order. Everything is under control. We are very happy. We are at the end. No, that's not the point here. And actually, although we are very optimistic, and we have to be optimistic because we have the vaccines, we have to look at the world, and we must vaccinate the world on a proper homogeneous rate. Let me move. So, of course, we're used to hear about Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, or Sputnik, but just also from an economic perspective, looking at what will be the future. At the moment, we have 27 vaccine candidates in phase 3, and there are 99 vaccine candidates at the moment in clinical studies. When I say clinical studies, I'm already adding a human component. If I have to add also the preclinical studies in animal models, we are talking about more than 189 vaccine candidates. So from an economic perspective, there are windows already open, still open for new molecule, for new product. There will be business for the future, not only as a boost. What is going to happen with all the people that already got 2 vaccine shots, etc., etc. All the future will be mRNA vaccines. No, this is not possible. So I will try to touch a little bit all these points, but this is from the New York Times, and I will come later also with the overview from WHO. So, you know, this is what the New York Times consider as the leading vaccines at the moment. It's not only about Pfizer and Moderna. It's not only about AstraZeneca and Sputnik. No, it's about other options. We have a lot of inactivated vaccines from China and from India that are strongly protecting the world, also with a lower efficacy, but this is a technical problem. It's not because they're coming from China, it's because the propion-lactone they use to inactivate the virus, unfortunately, led the protein to not be in the optimal stage. But this is a technical thing. In any case, this is a very interesting technology. I will touch a little bit on that later. Other vaccines are also coming very soon with some protein ones, etc., etc. So this is a fair overview on what is happening in the world. And although I couldn't find a more updated one, and I'm not here sponsoring China or Russia, I'm just showing the other sides. This is at the moment where actually nowadays more than 50 countries got more than 800 million doses of the vaccines from China and or from Russia. Whatever this will trigger geopolitics, these geopolitical games are included also in the US war for the vaccines, but this is the extra part of the world, okay? And sometimes we are lacking these informations, I think. So from a technical perspective, when we have to prepare a vaccine, when we have to design a vaccine, historically, the left side is what let's say usually is the safest one. You take the virus, you inactivate it. China can do it. You need big fermentator. You have to take this risk because you have to really have the living virus in your hands. You have to inactivate it. You have to be sure, batch per batch, that this virus is properly inactivated. And here we have the technology to have inactivated viruses. These are different vaccines from China, India, etc., etc. Very easy to share the technology. Egypt is already producing this one. Argentina is already producing inactivated viruses, inactivated vaccines. So this is a technology that has, like everything in science, advantages and disadvantages. On a total different point, we have what was the revolution from a biotechnological point of view. And these are the vaccines based on genetic material. Actually was not a real revolution because we had those molecules in hands already since 15 years coming from the public universities. So you have two options. You can close in a ball, in an inert ball, the mRNA, and this is the options from Pfizer and Moderna, where liposomes are like protecting this material. On the other side, you can also have DNA, but in this case, you really are taking like a Trojan horse, like the adenoviruses. And this is the option of the Sputnik and the vaccine from AstraZeneca, Oxford, etc., etc. In the middle, you have what is considered the most safest approach historically, also in terms of production, etc. And these are the subunit vaccines, where we do take a part of the virus, you let it grow or you prepare it in the lab, you mix it with the proper adjuvant, and these are at the moment 30% of all the vaccine candidates that have been tested in humans at the moment. So it's very important. And just to add another things, keep in mind that the bet that Europe lost when they were sharing, when they were buying blind the vaccines, they lost the bet with Sanofi because the option from Sanofi and GSK was a subunit vaccine, okay? That now is starting phase 3, but that was a gap that we did have, and this is what's going on. So we did have the option of Sanofi, and we will have the option of Sanofi. So the point is that the more delicate ones, like the mRNA ones, they do have a fantastic technology that maybe, in my opinion, it's hard to scale up and to contribute to vaccinate all the world, because mRNA is a very sensitive material. And whatever we're talking about, patent the full product, this inert shell I'm talking about, you have to keep in mind that due to the economic system, in most of the cases, some of the ingredients per se, they do have an extra patent. That means that I would like to see, when you have to share the technology, when you have to transfer the know-how, what is going to happen if now I have in my hands a vial, and with an easy experiment, I can immediately have in my hands the structure of these molecules. So maybe it's going to end like what happened with the HIV drugs, but then this is an extra things we do have to consider, the complexity of the ingredient and the technology behind mRNA vaccines. So among these three type of vaccine approaches, This is what we have at the moment if you look at the WHO webpage. Again, just to remark it, we do have 99 vaccine candidates at the moment. Among them, 30%, that actually are 30, are protein subunit vaccine candidates. Among these 30, 5 are coming from the public biotech in Cuba. So at the moment, Cuba is behind institutions like Sanofi to be maybe the first country not only in having vaccinated all its population with its own public vaccines, but at the moment, Cuba has a lot of chances to be the first country in accepting a subunit protein vaccines. Okay, so this is the first WHO overview. So what do we have at the moment in Cuba? In addition to be 5 vaccine candidates, people like me that have the honor to work and collaborate with and for Cuba, we know that vaccines have been always the strongest instrument that poor countries do have to fight regularly against what we can call it big pharma. Vaccine has never been a big market in, let's say, business for big pharma. The idea of protecting you against a parasite, a pathogen, or a virus for the rest of your life in this economic system maybe is not the best option. While poor country under embargo, like is happening in Cuba, they did invest all they had since 1970 to what we can call it one of the most fantastic idea of public biotech is BioCuba Pharma, that has 38 public institutions working for biotech and for vaccines. Cuba is able to design, develop, and produce the 85% of the vaccines that they did administer to their children. So it's not a surprise. So among them, we do have 3 candidates from Finland Institute in Havana. One of them is called Soberana 2. Is the only conjugate vaccine in the history of SARS-CoV-2. I'm not going to enter into the detail, but it's still a protein-based vaccine candidates. We do have, so this is finishing phase 3. This is immediately also in an interventional clinical trial, and this is also in a very interventional trial to the whole population, because there are a lot of variants of concern in Cuba. So because of data of phase 1 and phase 2, they were very safe and very good. Cuba, according with WHO, they decided to go already interventional with this molecule. In parallel, Soberana 1 is another candidate starting phase 2 very soon, and Soberana Plus, this product is the only product in the world designed specifically for convalescent, and also very interesting, cheap and safe product that could be economically and scientifically very interesting as a boost in schemes of vaccination 2+1. What is going to happen with 3 doses of Pfizer? What is going to happen with 3 doses of adenoviral vectors? From a safety perspective, but also from an economic perspective, why do we have to spend $15 to vaccinate you again with a 3rd dose of Pfizer when you can exploit cheap and safe products like this Soberana Plus or whatever is going to be something similar? The funny part is that having a public biotech not only allows you to differentiate the molecules. So Cuba has 5 vaccine candidates, 3 from Finland Institute and 2 from another institution that is called Centro de Ingeniería Genética y Biotecnología. Abdala is another candidate also that finished last week phase 3, and this is also entered already in more homogeneous and bigger scale. Mambisa is among the 5 worth candidate, is an intranasal vaccine candidate. Between Abdala and Soberana, Cuba aim to vaccinate 2 million of Cuban before August, and the idea is to vaccinate all the Cuban population with these vaccines. And this product will not stay in Cuba. There are already more than 40 countries interested in this public biotechnological product. So at the end here, I just want to comment on some approaches. So these are numbers, you know. WHO admit that 75% of the vaccines are giving out only in 10 countries. You can read it in another way, saying that the 0.1% of the vaccine have been administered in low-income countries, while 86% in upper middle income countries. Why do we have these differences? So I'm not going to criticize here the economic system. This is not the part of the job. I can bet that public biotech could be an option. So to conclude, I'm going to show you here my thought about what is going on, in my opinion, from a technical perspective, and not only. So usually companies, they invest not in a finished product. They prefer to have to invest in the means of production and in the labor power. But what this means, what do we mean with means of production? These have been paid by the government with public money. The factories, the first ideas, the university patents, and also the labor power. It means my colleagues working for Pfizer, they grew up in public universities. This is also something we have to consider in the equation. So the uptake of public money in all this equation is pretty big, in my opinion. So what is public and private is pretty difficult for me to understand in this equation. So, you know, the products per se are originated in public institutions. And in addition, I don't have a lot of good feelings with what was public-private relationships, because AstraZeneca Oxford was not something that ended very nicely for the public sector. If you have the Gates Foundations that is able to do what is doing with Oxford with AstraZeneca. So a temporary waiver of patents could be an option, but there are always questions regarding the know-how and also the transference of the technology and the ingredients per se. There are a lot, especially for mRNA vaccines. So if we don't want to always going back to the past, what happened with the HIV drugs, hepatitis drugs, I think that consider public biotech is something very interesting, and Cuba is proving it with product that can be very easily transferable between countries with public patent. Cuba is already able to transfer this technology with countries like Iran and Venezuela, for example, where in the past they already explore this technology with similar vaccines. So to conclude, I think that the example of Cuba, a poor country under embargo, able to design, develop, and produce. Cuba will produce more than 100 million doses only in 2021. So these things, I think Cuba is proving that public biotech, also if you're under embargo, is a solid option and is a concrete option to keep an homogeneous distribution of vaccines and biotech in general. So thanks a lot for your time. And this is actually the picture of the 5 Cuban public vaccine candidates against SARS-CoV-2.
Thanks a lot, Fabrizio. You really clearly explain us all the technicalities of vaccine production, and you provide also food for thought and food for the debate, including a provocative remark, I would say. So I would move to Paul Nightingale, who is professor of strategy at the University of Sussex. Paul got his PhD in science policy at SPRU, where he was also the deputy director, and he extensively published in leading international journals such as Research Policy, Industrial and Corporate Change, and so on. So, Paul, you have the floor. You should be able to share your slides, and you have 15 minutes.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can see it very clear.
Okay, right. Okay, apparently it's instantly translating into Chinese for people. Okay, I put you all up there. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the excellent introduction by the previous speaker. I will cover a bit of the same ground, and I'm gonna talk and give very much a kind of a UK perspective. I think there's a couple of, I get this to move. How's this going? First of all, I need to give some disclosure and a disclaimer. I work for the Public Science Funder in the UK, so everything I say is only my views and does not represent the views of anyone else. So I need to make that very clear. I am an academic 1 day a week. And then the other thing, I think, given that we're talking about IP and technology, it's important to highlight that there's problems with this area, and it's very important to articulate whether or not you're receiving funding from industry. I'm receiving no funding from industry. I've never received any funding. Okay. On to the kind of key issue that we're discussing. We're discussing a major public policy issue about property rights and the extent to which property rights apply when we're dealing with life and death situations. So this is something that Adam Smith worried about. Adam Smith is, someone who's pretty keen on markets, and he felt that anyone who overcharged someone who was starving for a piece of bread committed murder. So, there are obviously some kind of really serious kind of public concerns about if people are being prevented from accessing life-saving vaccines or other pharmaceuticals. We need to sort that out. And also we need to think about how we generate these kind of global public goods. I'm going to draw on ideas from Nate Rosenberg and Keith Pavitt, because I always draw on ideas from Nate Rosenberg. And the key thing I want to kind of get across there is R&D, R isn't the same as D, R&D isn't the same as trials and approval. Tech transfer and diffusion are different from trials and approval in themselves, different from delivery. So IP is only important in certain areas. And there's many other areas where there's some bottlenecks that I think we need to discuss. The thing I want to kind of take away, so if you want to kind of stop listening in a minute, is that we're not dealing with HIV. So it's a very, very different world from the previous concerns of the academic community concerns about IP and biopharmaceutical innovation. So the pandemic is very different, the industry is very different, the technology is very different, governance and bottlenecks are very different, and hence the role of patents and IP is very different. So while there are lots of problems with IP and healthcare more generally, I think we need to be particularly careful now and look in detail about how IP is being used and what the consequences of changing IP policy will be. Okay, so pandemic is very different. As Ohid, Jacob and I kind of highlighted, with the HIV pandemic, HIV hides behind the immune system. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to generate vaccines for that. So hence the focus was on small molecule therapeutics, the antiretrovirals. They are easy to produce at scale and protected by IP. Today, with the pandemic around COVID, there are a lot of vaccine projects going on, and there is a lot, as the previous talk highlighted, going into clinical trials. The pharmaceutical industry this time around is behaving very, very differently. So with HIV, the international pricing and IP enforcement was, I think, fair enough to say scandalous. I don't think there's anyone in the pharmaceutical industry who would defend what happened, particularly in relation to sub-Saharan Africa. Today, that behavior is very different. So AstraZeneca is providing the vaccine at cost for developing countries. Pfizer's pricing has not been based on trying to get as much money as possible. Their heuristic for pricing is, what is the cost of a takeaway meal? For middle-income countries, what is half the cost of a takeaway meal? And for developing countries, it's effectively being given away. And there's the institutional structure of COVAX, which is hoping to generate 9 to 11 billion doses this year, which is an enormous amount. Now, we do have a very serious coordination problem, and the vaccines are in the wrong places. So there are places in the world where healthy teenagers who are not at risk are being vaccinated, while around the world there are a lot of frontline healthcare workers who are going unvaccinated and risking their lives. So there's some serious problems that we need to address in the provision of those vaccines to the people who are most at risk, and also to the public that is most at risk, which is generally the elder population rather than the younger population. So there is a quite serious public policy, global equity issue about whether people like me should be being vaccinated compared to older people or people with particular kind of health concerns around the world. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about the different technologies. I want to contrast two technologies are really important because they highlight the different ways in which the vaccine is being generated and different roles of IP. So as we saw previously, there's different operational principles. The traditional way of producing vaccines is at the top here. So it's kind of killed vaccines. So the Sinovac vaccine is like this, or the attenuated one where you take a live vaccine and you pass it through a cell culture multiple times to reduce its severity. Now, these are effective, well-proven technologies that work well, but you need lots of virus, which is dangerous, and there's kind of safety concerns. The next two technologies are ones I'm going to talk about, which are fairly new. So the replicating viral vector, where you stick the gene that you want to express into a safe virus. These are generally safer, they generate a strong immune response, can be fairly difficult to produce, they're new. And then the new technology is the mRNA vaccines, which are safe. They're produced chemically rather than in a kind of a traditional biotech sense. So you print the genetic material, you then do a very complicated process of encasing it in a lipid coat so it can evade the immune system and get into the cell. And there's some really interesting technology going on there. The Imperial College vaccine unfortunately failed clinical trials, but that didn't just put the mRNA vaccine in, it put the factory to produce it into the vaccine. And then there's a whole load of other technologies which I'm not going to have a chance to talk about, but there is a lot of technology available now. So this is a very, very lucrative and scientifically and technologically interesting area of research and development. Okay, so let's look at Pfizer-BioNTech. So this grew out of some personalized mRNA cancer treatment technologies where they would look at cancers, they'd look at healthy tissues, they'd run an algorithm on the sequence, they'd identify some mutant genes, and then they would try and develop a vaccine specifically for that. So they would code the mutations, and then the technology switched over to the spike protein into a DNA plasmid, grow it in E. coli, and then use a chemical-ish process to kind of grow it up. And then you would take that and you would coat it in lipids to create these nanomedicines. It's an extremely fast technology. The Novartis took 8 days in 2013 to come up with a flu candidate. And the COVID candidate, there was 1 week between getting the sequence and having a project going into validation experiments. And that included making changes to the spike protein, which we highlighted earlier has some strange features. They're kind of easier to produce. So 90 to 120 days, so you can get them into clinical trials quicker, but they're harder to store. So this is the issue that we've all heard about needing to store them at -70. I do not think that that is a major issue for most developing countries. Most developing countries have access to hospitals and other facilities where you can have these super cold freezers. So it makes a lot of press, but I think it's an easier problem to solve, perhaps we initially thought. But the production of technology is extremely difficult and unpredictable to do at scale, and hence it tends to be bought in-house. There's a lot of microfluidics. There's, with each stage, between 100 and 1,000 quality controls, and the processes take a lot of time to stabilize. Right, can you hear me? Can I check?
Yes, I can hear you, but from time to time it was not so clear, Paul. So
yes, we can hear you.
But now it's okay. Now it's okay.
So if I go back to, I think, where we were, easy to produce, 90 to 120 days, gets them quicker into the clinical trials, but the production at scale is really difficult and unpredictable. There's lots of really advanced technology in that. There's lots and lots of quality control involved in every stage, so between 100 and 1,000 at each stage, and they take time to stabilize, refine, and optimize. This is difficult science to get to work. Okay, an example of why that is the kind of the creation of the nanolipids. So there's 4 different lipids that are integrated together, and they create this particle around the RNA molecule that allows it to avoid the immune system, to then find and attach itself to a human cell, to then, when it's attached to the human cell, change configuration, enter the cell, and then open up to release the mRNA unharmed, which then goes on to produce the protein on the surface cell, which triggers an immune response. It's a just-in-time production process, 100-odd components, has to work 24/7, time sensitive. A single component not turning up can cause the whole batch to be scuppered. So this is a kind of a classic Chandlerian production process. In order to manage the risks, you bring this in-house, but there's currently 2 production sites and we're going to move to 3. So it's a very, very difficult thing to get going. Okay, if we go into the Oxford AZ, a disclosure here. So the people I work for were involved in funding a lot of this work. Nothing to do with me, and nothing I say should be taken as critical of anything that anyone has done here. So what you're doing here is taking a harmless monkey virus, and you are putting a little bit of DNA into it so that when it goes into the human body, it expresses that that vaccine spike, which then triggers an immune response. Relatively easy to make compared to the other one. So they're planning 3 billion doses up to the end of the year, and you can refrigerate it to the normal freezer. 3 areas here, because this is a classic biotech production process. So upstream, you do a cell culture, you develop it and you cultivate it. Has to be extremely sterile. Downstream, once you've made it, you have to harvest it. So there's lots of really complicated filtration there. Again, very, very sterile and difficult to do. And then fill finish, where you formulate it, you put in additional inputs in order to enhance the immune response, make it stable, and the scale out for this is a different production process, and it isn't integrated in-house. This is much more around a kind of outsourcing, scale out, contracting with a network of global suppliers in order to allow coordination of a very complicated supply chain. So TRIPS and IP are used to coordinate that. I am not claiming it is the best way for it to be coordinated or the only way for it to be coordinated, but it is the way in which it's coordinated. There's about 150 partnerships it needs to negotiate in a very dynamic environment. And here there's currently 7, and we're moving to 11 sites on this. There are a lot of bottlenecks in this production process. So there are supply chain concerns around data, bioreactors, biobags, cell culture media, filters, gamma sterilization, so the radioactive sterilization of equipment, access to vials, LNPs, which is the nanoparticles, and then even simple things like the standardization of printed materials. If you're outsourcing production, that changeover can really constrain how fast you can go. And there's also kind of issues with kind of other access to kind of secure lab technologies. Okay, so both of these processes, in-house and scale out, require extensive supply chain and internal coordination. They are, as Giovanni, I'm sure will agree, much more complicated to be done through markets. Markets are not going to be able to coordinate this. Where I think I disagree with Giovanni is that whether states can do it on their own. And I think that's a point of debate later on. There's a task force that has been used to coordinate this. So the vaccine task force emerged around the time of the therapeutics task force, which is an attempt to do it in-house in governments. It is drawing on industry coordinated networks. It's a small team that cuts across industry and government with a fairly clear remit and governance, secure access to vaccines, create provision for international distribution, and then they've got this kind of third bit, the industrial I'm not going to talk about. Focus on speed, so getting vaccines that will get into the clinic within 2020 and can be manufactured at scale and get through rapid regulatory approval. Lots and lots of experience there about production. So they've drawn on experts from large pharma and from biotech. Links to COVAX, where the UK government put in 548 million, and plans to share the underutilized 357 million doses and get the production expertise boosted up around the world. They built 3 production sites. They have supported the clinical trials. So that's a very, very difficult thing to do. So 360,000 people in the UK have signed the clinical trial. It's a very, very difficult thing to get that number of people coordinated and on time. They help coordinate the supply chain, solve problems, and build trusted networks. And they were pretty successful in getting stuff out fast. Okay, so takeaways here. This isn't the HIV pandemic where IP was the big issue and the pharma industry were preventing people from accessing drugs. That's not what's going on here. There are really serious public policy issues, but it's around a whole range of other concerns. IP is only one of the complementary assets here. So we shouldn't even think that, you know, the IP is something that's owned by big pharma. So the IP for the two that we've been speaking about now, no, it's not. This isn't IP that's owned by Pfizer or AstraZeneca. The issue is production, supply chains, and scale out of technology transfer around the world, sorting out approvals. The FDA and NICE aren't the only regulatory approvals agencies in the world, but even if you get it out, it still has to be improved. The contracts and the distribution really need to be sorted out, and the distribution is really, really hard. With the mRNA technology, the IP isn't really the issue. So IP waivers exist and they don't work. So Moderna has already said, you can have it, you know, we're not going to enforce our IP, but no one's been able to copy it because it's so difficult to produce. The other IP waivers are available, but they would probably undermine the work of COVAX and the WHO, and there is a risk that they would mess up existing global supply chains. So the IP question about the future, I think, is separate from the IP question of today. I think we need to be careful about blaming IP for this, and we need to stick blame where it's due, which is there's been a lot of governments around the world which have failed to plan for this and have been naive and really haven't cared about their populations. And there's potential for a bit of, you know, unrealism about what an IP waiver will achieve and how quickly it would achieve anything. I'm not going to talk about incentives for future innovation. So the kind of conclusion here about IP waivers for me would be, you don't send people a cookbook in a famine. You get them the vaccines as soon as you can. Do that, you should focus on where the bottlenecks are, which is choice and contracts, COVID, regulatory approvals, and getting rollout of technology. And then the final conclusion is, this, I think, only applies for now. I think there's a very open public debate to be had about IP more generally, and particularly as we move on from a time when we aren't in COVID. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for your clear intervention. So now I would leave if I'm able to move the things, I will leave the floor to Giovanni, who is gonna, okay. Yes, you need to come here, but I want just to give you the possibility to talk. I'm not able to do it. I will try to make you discuss. It's a little problem. I'm not able to, you know, to make Giovanni, that is us, as the speaker. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Well, what I try to do is focus on the stylized facts that are highlighted by the medical therapeutic responses, especially vaccine responses to COVID. In other places we have discussed the impact of the containment measure in social and economic terms. Here I focus on what the vaccine response highlighted, in my view. First, it has been already emphasized by the intervention before me. It is quite impressive that a year after the first out of the pandemic, we have very many vaccines, some already used, some under trial. What does it mean? That we have distributed around the world an extremely rich body of knowledge awaiting for its therapeutic implementation. I mean, typically, vaccines means here, to be developed. This time, with sufficient effort, few months were sufficient. And along different, based on different knowledge bases and different technological trajectory of exploration. Well, the second fundamental side effect is that this knowledge has been originated largely in public and non-profit or non-profit institutions. Oxford, MIT, Harvard, University of Texas, Gamaliel Institute, University of Mainz, the public Cuban laboratories, and they've been explored there, or typically in spin-offs thereof, BioNTech, Moderna, that are essentially spin-off from university. Note that all the research, all the basic research is publicly supported everywhere and is often also publicly performed. Just to give you some numbers, in the new chemical entities approved by the Food and Drug Administration since 2010 were 210. All of them had, to different degrees, support from the National Institute of Health. Okay? Symmetrically, there is long-term evidence that the private sector, that is essentially big pharma, decreased its investment in basic research. So, if you want to elaborate a bit, developed its technology exploitation more parasitically over the body of research, of basic research developed in the public. And increasingly so. So the Aurora et al. Evidence, for example, shows that the output of scientific paper by big pharma has been falling. Well, it is not surprising that big pharma was unprepared facing the COVID crisis. And note, incidentally, but it's important, that all the previous anti-flu vaccines were developed under open science regimes. Okay? Of course, now comes the public, both in the US and in Europe, and flood the big pharma with an enormous amount of money. And big pharma say, yes, thank you, I'll invest a lot of effort in it. Obviously not surprising, and I'm not underestimating all the problem of scale up, etc. that Paul was underlining, not at all. I'm simply saying that the basic knowledge on which these vaccines are built is publicly generated. And the counterfactual is that you never had vaccines developed before, not even against AIDS. Why? Because it's much more convenient to develop a drug that makes chronic a disease, so you've got to inflict it throughout his life to the patient, rather than making a vaccine. Of course, if the public comes and then the big pharma is flooded with a conservative estimate to begin with of $26 billion, well, then it becomes a serious proposition. The third fundamental side effect is that what it reveals about the political economy of the private-public relation. So that essentially the government, to different extent, and different extent is important, are essentially hostage of big pharma, notwithstanding the fact that the knowledge has been generated in the public. We are beyond regulatory capture that we study in the textbook. We are in the state of reversal of the relationship between the state and private actors. With a big difference, I was saying. The European Union epitomizes the complete abdication by public authorities from their function. The US have kept a system of command and control in place since the Defense Production Act of 1950. And the Defense Production Act allows the President to order the production and distribution of goods and equipment and the requisition of property. And if you don't do it, it's a criminal offense, it's a felony. This provision has been used repeatedly by both Trump and Biden. More specifically, in the case of COVID, you have a Pandemic and All Other Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act of 2019 that builds on another act, 2006, that construct an agency called BARDA. BARDA is a public agency that distributed most of the $18 billion to the private sector. There, I mean, it is like in the US, you have a privatization of the war. I go back to the war metaphor, in which you hire mercenaries like Halliburton and Iraq, but at least, and you pay a lot, but at least you set a target and you say, well, you've got to win this bloody war. I order you to win this bloody war. The European Union is hiring mercenaries and telling them, well, fight whatever war you want. I leave it up to you. Tell me how much money do you want, I'm going to give it to you. Be good. Do your best. It is a totally scam. Well, of course, behind it, there is this ideology that now only the European literary apply, that the market knows better and the private sector knows better, of course. The developing countries and all that are faring even much worse. I mean, with much weaker condition of the same, lacking also an incompetent and incorrupt bureaucracy, decimated in number by the Washington Consensus policy, I mean, and without first the manufacturing capabilities to make vaccine under license. It was already said before, and even fewer having the political power of invoking Article 27, 31, and 73 of the TRIPS, that is the international agreement, that technically allows countries, for reason of health, of security, to make exception to the IPR. More generally, I think that this crisis has highlighted the dramatic damages of the neglect or the withdrawal of the states from considering health a universal public good and knowledge as equally a universal public good, correspondingly allowing the market to expand its domain of control. Now, what to do? I mean, there has been this proposal of a Biden administration of the waiver, for sure is better than nothing, with all the caveats that has been underlined repeatedly, that if a waiver on the patent does not mean that the country is able to produce the vaccine. Some will, many will not. But if you allow re-export, those that will be able, say India, South Africa, Brazil, will tend to cover also the supply to other countries. In any case, I mean, this is not, of course, the inability of many countries to produce vaccine without, even without licensing, is not a good reason to keep intellectual property right. On the contrary, is a good reason to foster the Cuban route, the development of local capabilities that turn around the corner of IP rights. The deeper solution in the long term is that one needs a profound reform of both intellectual property right, especially in pharmaceuticals, and in the relationship between the state and the private in the exploration, development, and production of new drugs. I mean, after all, you have the public that does basic research. This is everywhere, paid with public money. Then typically the molecules or the techniques, like in the case of biotech, are transferred to either biotech company or directly to big pharma at ridiculously low price or for free if there is a spin-off. The big pharma does clinical trials and then trials on humans. And then on this vaccine is a bit an exception, as Paul was saying, because they don't charge ridiculous markup, also because they received in advance these 26 billions that, well, I'm not counting the money from the UK, sorry, but just continental Europe and the EU and the US. So, I mean, they should be content, right? They charge the price for the vaccine. If the trial would be done, that is phase 3, would be done by the public, as it should, then the last step, the very production, could be given on a non-exclusive basis to pharmaceutical firms to produce. But at that point, they must produce it at almost marginal cost. And I mean, I'm exaggerating, but an antibiotic will cost, I mean, it's an exaggeration, like a beer. It's like a fermentation. It's a very complicated fermentation. Will not cost the thousands of euros that the new generation of antibiotics that are not there yet will cost. I think that this taking this route will have some major positive social effect. One will imply the regaining of the public of the control of the rate and direction of innovative activity. Second, will expand the public control on, to repeat, knowledge, health-related knowledge, and health as a universal right. It would have negative cost. And finally, last but not least, it would be a major equalizer in the access to life-saving drugs between developed and developing countries and between rich and poor people, which I think is not marginal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Giovanni. Actually, I forgot to present you, to introduce you. You know, you don't need an introduction, but okay. Giovanni Dozzi is Deputy Director of the Growing Pro Project, is one of the leading scholars in innovation. So I would move to the last talk, and I would like to introduce Margaret Kyle, who is a professor they call the Mean, actually. And she got a PhD at MIT, and she has been extensively published on pharmaceutical industry in top journals such as the RAND and the Review of Economic Statistics. So Margaret, thank you a lot for being with us, and you have 15 minutes as the other speaker.
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate. Because I'm an economist, I specifically requested going last so that I could free ride on my co-panelists' efforts to explain vaccine technology and lay out many of the issues that makes it much easier for me. I think that provided a useful summary that I can't add anything to. I think actually on the narrow issue of IP with COVID vaccines, we seem to roughly be in agreement that IP is probably not the major barrier to access in developed countries or developing countries, that the issues are much more around production capacity and distribution. So in a way, I'm not sure why we're talking about IP in the context of COVID vaccines other than this discussion about patent waivers. So I think the good news is that with or without IP, with or without a patent waiver, once the supply constraints are relaxed, we can look forward to plenty of competition between the many vaccines that are already available or will soon be available. And again, to the extent that you think markups are too high on the existing vaccines, certainly I would expect to see competition bringing those down. But right now, you know, the vaccines there are not enough being supplied to the developing world, but it's not clear that the markups on that supply are ridiculous. So as Paul noted, this is not HIV. This is just not the same situation. So on the bigger question of, you know, not just COVID vaccines and will a patent waiver improve the situation? I think Giovanni said, well, it's better than nothing. I actually am not so sure that that's true, because I think the signal that sends for the development, not just of vaccines, but more importantly, for other kinds of treatments for COVID, but for other kinds for other diseases as well, this might discourage private firms from investing in global treatments that are easy to manufacture, because those are exactly the ones where the patent waiver is going to matter. And ex ante, a private firm looking to maximize profits is not going to see that as a particularly profitable area. So if the goal is in fact to align the incentives of the private sector and their research investment with those of society, I think this would be counterproductive. But of course, Giovanni doesn't think that we should necessarily leave pharmaceutical development to the private sector. And so I think it's worthwhile, you know, if the bigger issue is the role of the public sector versus the role of the private sector. I think we all agree, there's no debate, that the public sector invests more in basic research. Now, in part, that's because basic research cannot be appropriated by private investors. So of course, the public sector invests more. I think it underinvests for all sorts of reasons. Most of Europe, I would just note, is below the Lisbon goal of 3% overall. So not just talking about medical research or biopharmaceuticals. Overall, Europe has not managed to get its act together, even on something that there's a commitment to. Okay, of course, it being Europe, there's commitments, but none of them are actually enforced. So perhaps that's part of the problem. I think with the public sector, we also have to acknowledge that this is subject to free riding of governments on the spending of other governments. So there is disproportionate public support from the NIH in the US. Europe does not contribute enough, in my view. And just to give you a sense of the size of these budgets, the 2019 budget for the NIH was around $40 billion. That's about what the members of the trade association pharma spent in 2019 on R&D. Okay, so it's quite significant. It's about half of total public spending in the world relative to other governments. And if you think about, well, could we move to a world in which we don't have so much private sector investment, but that has to somehow be made up for by public investment? That's at least a doubling of the NIH budget. Okay? So I don't think that's trivial from a political economy standpoint. Okay? So it's just not clear to me that most governments are positioned to take on the substantial costs of clinical development, not across the board. Now, I'm sure that there are isolated areas where the private sector has not viewed something as sufficiently profitable, has neglected it, and there's a stronger case to be made for government doing everything from basic research all the way through trials and production. But I think that those are more exceptions rather than the rule. And I have to say, my reaction to what I've seen of government behavior over the last year and a half does not inspire much confidence, at least from me, in the ability to develop drugs and vaccines all the way through phase 3 and to production. First, let's just think about the basics of trying to run clinical trials. For COVID, these were generally massive multinational trials. Okay, so now we're talking a lot of coordination between countries, which did not seem to be going very well when this pandemic started. Okay, remember, there are all the debates over export restrictions, everything else. We didn't see a lot of coordination or cooperation between governments at that point. So coordinating on massive clinical trials, especially when there's always going to be interest in putting the trials in your own country or somehow getting your share of the big pot of money that's suddenly there, I don't see that as particularly realistic. I think what we've seen over the last year and a half is a lack of trust within countries and their own governments, made worse by their performance during COVID, in addition to a lack of trust in foreign governments. So it's just not realistic for me to imagine that we can overnight make this transition from the private sector, which did very well. In part, there were good public policies as well, helping to guide that private sector investment. But I think the performance of the private sector in coming up with vaccines so quickly, yes, using science that originated in universities and public labs, of course. But on the execution at the end, the private sector didn't really let us down so much. So I think we should hesitate before being so critical of that. It's not at all clear to me that if the US or the EU governments did all of the development and all of the manufacturing, that right now we would see the developing world better off. Really look at the excess vaccines that are sitting, the AstraZeneca vaccines not approved in the US, sitting in the US that are not going very rapidly around the world. And the same is true in Europe, right? So I don't see why we have any reason to believe that if it were government from soup to nuts in terms of the basic science all the way through production, that the developing world would be better off. We have the examples of the Russian and Chinese vaccines. These have not saved the developing world, at least not yet. I hope that they do. Okay, and I hope that there's help from the other vaccines as well. Access to them is not free in the sense of it does seem to come with conditions and geopolitical concerns. So it's just not at all obvious to me that that's the model. I think vaccine nationalism, which has certainly been a problem, that's more likely in the absence of private firms who are at least looking to license their IP pretty broadly. I wouldn't point to the Defense Production Act as a model for other countries. I don't think that's been good for the world. It has been good for the US, at least in the short run, but I'm not sure that that's what we would want every country around the world to be moving towards, given that I think international coordination in situations like this is especially important. So for me, the lessons from the last year and a half, and I think we're all going to agree that investment in basic science has a huge payoff, and we should do more of it. There's no question in my mind about that. And as I said, I think that that's a point of agreement for all of us. In this situation, I don't think patents were necessary to induce that R&D investment. The advanced purchase commitments were enough. I think that that's something that could be explored for other applications. I mean, antibiotics being an obvious example. But those prize models or advanced purchase commitments often do require, again, international cooperation and coordination, and we shouldn't take that for granted. Again, what we've seen over the last year and a half is that international institutions failed us and national governments failed us, and they failed to coordinate at critical times. So that for me is also a lesson that we need to rethink how that is all structured. At a more sort of basic level, well, national level, let's say, I think we should, particularly in countries like Europe, where health systems are national for the most part, look for opportunities to exploit those to a greater degree. So I'll actually point to the UK as a particularly good example of this. The UK was very quick to initiate these big clinical trials, the recovery trial and others, using the fact that the system is national. That kind of organization, the government help organizing research and making the resources of its data, et cetera, available. That I think is another avenue that we should be exploring, and much more public-private collaboration in areas like that. That's where the U.S. system, which is highly decentralized, it suffers in comparison. But again, the UK did well on this. Most European governments did not do so well on that, and that's unfortunate, because they're sitting on a lot of information and a lot of resources and a lot of infrastructure that were not used to maximum capacity. So with that, I'll end, and I'm sure that it will be quite a spirited discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Margaret. Before opening the floor to the question, I would like also to make some few comments, also to as a sort of provocation for the speaker. Well, I was reading a lot of things about patenting this day, and I was very interested in this paper published on Nature, where basically they were discussing the issue that patents were not made for pandemics, or they were not made for wars, and indeed they were making the example of penicillin. And it seems really to me that something that we as economists sometimes don't really explore in any possible direction is the role of monopoly power. Indeed, what we have observed, coming back to the point of Paul, is that nobody has given, there is no point in giving a cookbook to the developing country, but at the same time, we have not provided any bread. Indeed, no technology agreed to share no firm, agreed to share the technology in the technology access pool organized at the World Health Organization. That's why also it came this idea of waive the patent. But at the same time, the firms are really making extra profits. So if you read the latest quarterly budget of Pfizer, she's making a return of higher than 20% on the vaccine. And indeed, it seems to me that also monopoly power has a clear role also in the technology transfer. I mean, I totally agree with you that here is not just a problem of patent. So it's not just that removing the patent, we solve the problem of the production with all the bottlenecks that all of you have highlighted. But I think that there is a strong connection also between monopoly power and the transfer of knowledge. I mean, in the sense that if a big firms want, it can transfer the knowledge in 2 or 3 months, at least if you check what the director of chemistry of Moderna declared, but also the experience of Moderna with the Lonza firm in the Switzerland. So it seems to me that what we need is, I mean, this role of patent, what could be a possible is patent waiver, but also there is an issue of industrial policy. And it seems that here we should really think and reflect on the possible role of a sort of global operation warp speed, as the US has organized, that has worked very well in the US. So we could have something at the global level. And I think that in also that, suspending the wave and the role of the state can also have a role in rebalancing the power, the monopoly power that the patent brings. But I mean, I don't want to take any other time. Are there any questions here or in the web? Otherwise, I will open the floor and I will. Alessandro, do you have any question? Any comments? Yeah, now I see it. So please talk.
No, yes, it was interesting. It was interesting to see the different position. And I have a question for Margaret, no? Because it seems to me that her point would be that the system, the configuration of the system actually in this circumstance, in this instance is not so terrible in a sense. Okay, so my question is, why do you think so the Biden administration has made this step? So what was the reason? So they didn't have a clear view of the system or the situation. Did they? So I would be interested really in knowing your view about the motivation. Then a more general comment would be that, again, always on Margaret, and it's close to what Andrea has said, it is that I think that whatever waiver it is applied, maybe this will provide maybe some more opportunities for vaccine developments in this area. Not only for now, for the future, for getting more, for something for the future, for third, fourth, fifth waves. So it's clear that we are in a special situation, like a bit war or a world pandemic. So it's not business as usual. So I don't think that the deterring effect for pharmaceutical companies would be so high in a sense. We are in a special situation. What has been decided in this context, I think, on both sides. So also the contract, the advanced purchase contract that the European Union made with Pfizer and AstraZeneca and so on, and the company had difficulties to fulfill their obligation. So it's a really a special situation. And so I'm not so sure if a general argument about deterrence could hold. So I would like Margaret to respond on these two questions.
So I guess being very cynical, my guess would be that the Biden administration decided to agree with, actually, it was not the Biden administration's proposal, it was their agreement not to object to that proposed by developing countries. Cynically, I suspect that the Biden administration could count on Germany and other countries to not have it go through. So it makes his political base happy without actually having any effect on patent rights. As for the deterrent effect, I think if we move to a model of these advanced purchase commitments for COVID treatments, et cetera, then we don't need patents. I completely agree that prizes are a preferred tool for R&D and pulling R&D in precisely the direction that we want in a situation like this. So it's not that I think patents were the ideal policy instrument here. I don't think they're the friction with vaccine production, but I certainly wouldn't say that, oh, we should use the patent system as the model going forward in a comparable, or hope we never see a comparable pandemic, but a situation like that. So absolutely, alternatives to IPRs should be discussed. But as I said, let's not underestimate the difficulty of implementing those in practice. So again, international coordination generally is going to be required. So if we want a novel antibiotic, for example, that's going to probably require pooled resources for an advanced market commitment. And that's been discussed now for years, and very little movement, serious movement in that direction so far. So I hope with COVID, the situation is sufficiently drastic that governments are motivated to react, and that we can come up with some kind of agreement, at least among developed countries, to put in place a prize for COVID treatments, et cetera. There would probably be some debate afterwards about, well, was it just an antiretroviral previously developed for something else that Pfizer or somebody else took off the shelf, and is that really what we want? But anyway, so the deterrent effect is if we rely on patents as the incentive mechanism going for COVID treatments. If we decide that we're going to use a different incentive mechanism, then yeah, we don't have to worry about patents and we don't have to worry about deterrence.
Thanks a lot, Margaret. So Paul, do you want to, I leave you the floor so you can talk and reply.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Margaret. So I think Margaret's absolutely right with what President Biden was doing. And President Biden is someone who I'm very, very impressed with in terms of public policy. So it was the Republic of South Africa and Rwanda and other countries which were kind of pushing this through. I think it was a low risk thing to do. It was fairly obvious you wouldn't get everyone agreeing in the WTO, and you could wait several years for that organization to kind of move forward on this. So it was never a kind of a serious thing. I do think countries like South Africa have legitimate concerns about how the global intellectual property kind of system works. And I think kind of COVID has really exacerbated that. I think that is something that we do need to look into the future. In terms of there's a kind of a couple of things which I think are kind of I like to kind of highlight. One on the advanced purchase stuff. So in the UK, it was done at risk. So if it didn't work, we weren't going to pay for it, but we did provide support in the UK. I think and then there's the final point. I think is this kind of picture of it's either the market or the state. I think Margaret is exactly right, it's not just one state. There isn't a single global government that agrees about everything. Global governments internationally have their own problems about coordination. And I think in this, we have seen big problems of international coordination across governments. And I think we need to be a bit realistic about that. My last point would be, I'm not sure that the pharmaceutical industry has over profited from this. I'm actually a bit concerned that the overall problem with vaccine production is that it's not a profitable industry. Industry doesn't come in and produce vaccines generally. Over the last 50 years, vaccine production in the private sector has gone down and down and down. So at the start of the pandemic, the UK had only one production facility in the whole country for vaccines. So I think that we still have a big problem of massive market failures with vaccine production, and maybe the suggestion about prizes is the way to go.
Thanks, Paul. Before passing the floor to Fabrizio, I want to just make two quick. Yeah, Giovanni, you're gonna be the last, and then the other can talk.
Before Fabrizio.
Okay. Well, Giovanni, come here.
No. I will be telegraphic. I mean, I think, Margaret, the answer to your doubts on the role of government, the need of coordination, the answer is Cuba. Cuba has got few million inhabitants, is under embargo, cannot import because the Americans don't want have a blockade since 60 years, and they were able to develop a vaccine alone and test it alone at very low cost, at a cost affordable by a developing country under embargo. More than that, I don't know what you want. I mean, and in fact, the cost of even scaling up, one says we're scaling up, cost a lot. We don't know because it's a secret, bigger than the code of the Pentagon. But the data that we have on the cost for Moderna of scaling up with a Swiss company to produce billion of vaccines was of the order of 400 million. So one order of magnitude lower than what was transferred to Big Pharma in advance, in addition to what will transfer. I mean, I think that there is a deeper dysfunctionality. And you're right in pointing, Margaret, to other domains outside vaccines. For example, immunotherapy for cancer. That was basically developed at Harvard Medical School, then picked up by Novartis. Well, it had the cost of manufacturing, standardizing, etc., etc. But the cost per patient of $300,000, it seems to me a little bit too much, and is going to destroy all public health system or continue business as usual in the US, that the rich can get it and the poor die. I think that this reveals a deep dysfunctionality of the entire system. I mean, and this is related, I think, to the very privatization. I think this should be the discussion, not IPR or not. Is the privatization, is health a good or is health a public right? And that, I mean, because if it is a good, then I mean we can expand it and say also justice is a good. Let's privatize it. I mean, in the US it's partly privatized. In Italy it's privatized in another way, and says that Berlusconi can pay the judges. So it's another way, I mean, of having the market inside. But I don't know where one should stop. I mean, Posner and Becker would claim that you could sell yourself as a slave, and this is part of your own right. I mean, in the market. I mean, my point is that this is well beyond vaccine and everything. Is that this is the chance of having the market moving back. And therefore also the domain of incentives. Moving back, I mean, historically, the search of knowledge was driven by curiosity and not by, or incentives that they were not in monetary incentives. Intrinsic motivation, the economists use it today. It is time to, I think, push back the domain to which monetary incentives apply. And this goes, I mean, it's a broader discussion of political economy, of course. It goes beyond the IPR question. I have it at Margaret on this side.
Can I respond to that? I mean, from my perspective in the UK, I think that's happened. I mean, I think, you know, I think we did reach a low point with the HIV pandemic and the way kind of IP was managed, particularly in developing countries there. And then since then, there's been, you know, a massive international realization that that was a low point and a kind of a step back, and a re-emergence of all sorts of interesting organizational structures that work internationally and combine the public and private and NGO sectors together, and that has moved away from that problematic approach, and has been difficult to make work. I mean, I think, and all bits of it have had their problems. I think as the history is written, we will see more and more of those problems emerging. But we have kind of moved away from the world that Giovanni has highlighted, and I think that bit of it has been relatively successful. Is that a fair view?
I can add something not directly linked to what Professor said. And of course, being a scientist working with Cuba, a lot of the things that Professor Dossi mentioned, I totally agree with him. I just want to highlight two things. The first one is Cuba did what they did under embargo. Because of course it's easy for everyone to say, oh, but we already have the mRNA vaccines. Cuba, they're finishing phase 3 or whatever. No. They are already in front of Sanofi with an embargo. I don't know if it's clear the concept of blockage, So I can tell you already that Cuba, without all the restriction from the USA, they would have already vaccines for, let's say, 1/3 of the world of a really low cost. Second point, look what my colleagues decide. Okay, this is the technology we have. And this is a technology that we're already sharing with Iran, with Venezuela, with Algeria, or whatever it is. The infrastructure is already there. The know-how is already there. The ingredients are already there. Public, 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 with a public patent. SARS-CoV-2 is coming. Perfect. From a structural point of view, we took the receptor binding domain. That's our antigen. You have to change one ingredient. The facilities are there. The know-how is there. The ingredients are there, are public, there is a list already. So, Cuba is really proving it. It's not for fun. Under blockage, I don't know if you have no experience with them, blockage is something terrible. It's an act of terrorism, is my opinion. And the second point I want to mention is that I did love the idea of having the AstraZeneca-Oxford partnership. But please, I would like to know in 1 year what Bill Gates said to Oxford to convince AstraZeneca to take all of what was 50-50 private-public. Because if this public-private sector is still in the hands of the philanthro-capitalist, sorry, this is not the solution, in my opinion. Because the Gates Foundation is damaging all this situation. Okay, philanthrocapitalism is not an option, and the COVAX program is proving it. It was supposed to be, first of all, Cuba cannot participate in the COVAX program because for the Gates Foundation, Fabrizio Chiodo and my Cuban colleagues were considered terrorists. Okay, then just to be fair. So what is the COVAX problem? The COVAX solution is not a solution, and numbers are proving it. South Africa already paid for it and they didn't receive anything back. So this type of imperialism linked with philanthrocapitalism, and sorry if I'm using old school terminology, this is the one I'm linked to. This is not the solution. So I do think that maybe public private agreement could be an option, but if this is the results, no, I don't think so. I do think that for high risk level drugs or high risk important emergency concept like vaccines, in the Netherlands, they were making public vaccines until 1995. Denmark, they were making public vaccines until 1993. So for vaccines, in my opinion, public biotech is the only option. But this is maybe a naive suggestion, someone working with Cuba, but trust me, if a poor country under embargo is doing it, already sharing the technology with other countries, Iran is already almost producing it, So I do think that we don't have to trust philanthrocapitalists in the public private sectors. That these numbers are, and let's say history will tell us what will happen in the next years. What I don't want is that if the next virus will come, we are back and back and back, always on the same problem.
Margaret, do you want to reply for a second round?
So I hope that Cuba's vaccines are successful as you've described, and that they are made available to all the countries that need them rapidly. I'm all for that. I certainly understand that that it's remarkable that Cuba has gotten this far, given the constraints in place. I'm not sure how easy it is to replicate that model around the world. You tell me, is Cuba really exceptional among poor countries, or could you have the research environment and the ability to run the trials and all of that take place in other poor countries? If so, then why are we having this discussion? Every country should already have their vaccine candidates, and we wouldn't really be having this issue. So I don't think it's that easy to replicate. But you know better than I do what's going on in the labs there. I do think, you know, we can talk about, you know, what can be designated as pure public goods, where we really just don't trust the market, either for the incentives created by the private market for investment, for developing new vaccines, as well as on the production side. That's a debate to have. Personally, I'm not comfortable with the idea of replacing all pharmaceutical manufacturing by nationalized production. I don't think that's worked for very many goods historically. If we're unhappy with, for example, cancer treatments that cost 300,000 euros, well, who's paying that? It's the governments, it's the big payers in these countries who have set up a system where the incentive is not to come up with a cure. The incentive is to come up with these treatments. So Giovanni mentioned this, changing a disease into a chronic condition that requires, monthly treatments for the rest of a patient's life. Well, that's the result of health systems that underpay for cures. I mean, governments are in control of not just patents, but other aspects of creating innovation incentives, and I think that is a problem. That there isn't enough recognition that what national governments decide to pay for, that sends a signal to private investment as to where they should be investing their money, and so if you're unhappy with it, think about fixing that as well. And if you can't, explain to me why you can't fix that, but you can somehow fix everything through public research. That is just that's not clear to me. Maybe, but it's not obvious to me that that's a simple fix.
Okay, thanks a lot for your reply, Margaret. Are there any questions or other comments? Otherwise, I think we can close the meeting here. And let me thanks again, Margaret, Kyle, Paul Nightingale, and Fabrizio Chiodo, and of course also Giovanni Dosi, for coming here and provide different opinion about the role of property rights and vaccine in the time of the pandemics. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thanks to everyone. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.